Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this presentation by our distinguished scholar, John Alderete. I'd like to thank you for accepting the invitation and for being present with us today. So for the audience, John Alderete from Simon Fraser University from Canada. John is interested in phonetics and phonology, morphology, fieldwork, linguistics, and cognitive science. John defended his PhD dissertation in 1999, the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And John worked closely with distinguished scholars such as John McCarthy, Elizabeth Selkirk, John Kingston, and others. John's research gives close formal analyses of phonological and morphological systems and asks how these systems are learned and represented in larger theories of cognitive science. His dissertation and related work address theoretical questions concerning how phonological structures and the morphological influences on these structures can be formalized in constraint-based theories of grammar. His later work extended these questions, fieldwork, computational, and experimental methods to probe the learnability and viability of these structures, as well as how they are encoded and accessed in online production processes. His current focus, actively pursued with his students in the Language Production Lab, investigates how language, particular phonological structures, shape speech production processes. So this is what your website says. John has a number of publications in very serious linguistics journals, including Linguistic Inquiry, Phonology, Natural and Linguistic Theory, the Linguistic Review, Canadian Journal of Linguistics, Language and Speech, Language and Linguistics Compass. His selected publications, there are many, I can't read through all of them, but I could just mention, for example, his dissertation entitled Morphological Governed Accent in Optimality Theory, which was published in 2001 with Routledge as a Routledge Outstanding Dissertation in Linguistics. His work also focused at one point in time, that's in the mid-2000s, probably in 1997. His work on assimilation as local conjunction is a very influential one, and his paper in Cambridge Handbook Phonology on Dissimilation in Grammar and the Lexicon, together with Steve Frisch, I guess, is also a very good read. Very recently, John published with Lee Redwan a chapter entitled Frequency Norms in Tashhita City, which appeared in the Handbook of Berber Linguistics. So John knows a little bit more than some of us when it comes to Berber linguistics, by the way. Okay, so we're happy to have John here with us. We're actually very delighted. And his presentation today is entitled Speech Error Analysis in the 21st Century, Overcoming Methodological Problems, Developing Technical Solutions. Okay, so before giving the floor to John, I'll just take half a minute so that people get settled. We'll be running out of space soon. Yeah, we have more chairs coming in. Okay. So I would like to welcome you all to this presentation. We have our wonderful masters and doctoral students around, And we have colleagues from different institutions. Khalid from IRCAM Rabat, Lubna Al-Wardi. I don't know if you've been recruited yet or not. Okay, from Jadida still, okay. And Ziani Zoubida from the Faculty of Education, Hamid Sharfi Same, Si Abdelaziz Boudler from the Faculty of Letters in Casablanca, Si Hassan Makhad from Jadida. And I have colleagues of ours. We have Si Qbaz Tari, Si Nordi Amrous, Si Driss Al-Ayadi, Malika Abu Murad. And Zaid is sitting back there. He's from Jadida. Okay, I hope I have not missed anyone. And Si Ahmed Smirqou there. Okay, so you're all welcome to this presentation. And I'd like to also thank administrative support. Professor Dr. Leila Munir has always been supportive of everything we do in this university, especially the journal, our journal Langues et Littératures, which is organizing this event. And I'd also like to address sincere thanks to Dunia, whom we don't see here. She is always in the background. And also to Mohsin Amrani for the technical and logistics support. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. John Alderete. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a delight to me to come to Rabat and present my research. Yesterday I spoke of Tashahid, and unfortunately there's no Tashahid in today's lecture, but we'll talk about English and Cantonese. I apologize. Vous pouvez poser des questions en français, je peux répondre, mais il vaut mieux que je parle anglais. If I speak in French, I'll make many mistakes and I'll get embarrassed, and it'll also be very confusing to you, so it's really better if I speak English. We can use the slides if there's any communication problems, and we can translate together. The slides, the data, and the articles that we'll talk about today are available on the website, so you can go there if there's something of interest. And I will say that this is a psycholinguistic talk in a sense, but there's lots of phonology in psycholinguistics. So if you like phonology, I hope this is an invitation for you to get an interest in speech error research. So the first thing to know about speech errors, or slips of tongue, is that they're rich in phonological structure. There's a phonology to speech errors, and there are many generalizations that psycholinguists have established about speech errors. So there's the single phoneme effect, which is that basically when sounds slip in a slip of tongue, like leading list for reading list, it's generally a single phoneme. There's also the syllable position effect, which is that sounds tend to slip in the same positions. So leading list is an onset slipping from an onset position, not an onset to a coda. That would be different. There's the phonological similarity effect. Phonological similarity, of course, is really important to analyses of assimilation and so forth. So intended and intruder sounds tend to be phonologically similar. P and F are phonologically similar, and they tend to slip, but P and R are different, and they're much less common. There's another effect called the repeated phoneme effect, showing the importance of phonemes. And perhaps the most phonological constraint of all is the phonological regularity effects. That is, speech errors tend to be governed by phonotactics. When a sound slips, it tends to slip into syllables that are phonotactically licit in the language where it's observed. So there have been many ways in which phonology has informed psycholinguistics. Many insights from phonology that have guided psycholinguistic models, and perhaps the first one is the single phoneme effect, right? So in psycholinguistic models of speaking, that is models of language production, the idea is that our mental lexicon is represented as a phonological network, and the selection of sounds in speaking involves a kind of a flow of activation through this network, and a selection of a node that is the most active, that is the most receiving most activation in this large network. And that selection is focused, or it's a selection of phonemes, right? So the phoneme structure is kind of built into that network, and we can only really account for the single phoneme effect if we recognize phonemes within this network. So that's a contribution from phonology. Another contribution from phonology is the phonological regularity effect. So in these phonological networks, basically energy flows through the network a sound is selected and then it's inserted into a syllable frame, very similar to the syllable frames that were prevalent in 1980s phonological theory. This is exactly like Ito's theory of syllable structure, and it's the same basic idea. Sounds go into these syllable templates, and those syllable templates are governed by the same kind of constraints that phonologists know and love. Psycholinguistics has also helped out phonology. Slips of tongue, in a sense, demonstrate the psychological reality of phonological structures. So phonological constituents such as segments or auras, or even in Chinese languages, atonal syllables, as syllables without a tone, slip in speech errors, and that's evidence for those sound structures in the minds of native speakers. There's also evidence for phonological constraints and phonological processes. And psycholinguistics is actually a really good testing ground for comparing hypotheses. So a common thing in Chinese languages is to ask if a consonant-glide combination, if that glide is a secondary articulation or a sequence of two consonants, right? And people have used speech error evidence to answer a question that's primarily a phonological question. You know, how do we analyze these segments and fit them into well-formed syllable structure? So the facts of slips of tongue have been primary sources of evidence for deciding among linguistic theories. I could go on and on about the different contributions of psycholinguistics to phonology and phonology to psycholinguistics, and I think there's general acceptance of the interdisciplinary nature of this exchange. Yet there are a host of problems in the collection and analysis of speech errors, and I'd like to focus on two today. One stems from the methods used to collect and analyze speech errors, and in the early days, in the 1970s, 1980s, it was plagued with a set of problems of data collection. The data quality was rather poor. It depended on data collection methods where people would just go to cocktail parties and listen to their friends, or even get information from other friends, and it had a very as a result, they were skewed by certain perceptual biases of the data collectors, and there was poor sample coverage. So what I want to talk about today is what I've been doing in the last 10 years in improving the methods of collecting and analyzing speech errors, and show that this really does have an impact on the analysis of speech errors. Another persistent problem is a lack of linguistic diversity. So like in much of psycholinguistics, speech error research is skewed towards a small number of majority languages, English, German, Dutch, and it fails to capture the diversity of human communication. So almost all the studies are from the top 10 major languages of the world. There is at least two studies of Arabic, but I don't know of any studies of Tashahate speech errors. Perhaps you can let me know about that. Yeah, so that's the problem, right? And so one of the things that we did was we did the first study of Cantonese, a Chinese language, and looked at the phonological structures of Cantonese to inform linguistic theory. So let's talk a little bit about methods. So for the past 10 years, I've developed what's called the SFU Speech Error Database. The larger goal was to create and validate the methods for collecting speech errors and analyzing them, and document the rich linguistic structure of speech errors. So we have long-form representation of the speech error with certain markups, so you can use computers to analyze it. And we have over 100 different variables for cross-classifying them and kind of drilling down. We also have speech errors based on audio recordings, which enables you to do various kinds of speech analysis, one of which I did on the phonetics structure of speech errors, which perhaps we could talk about today. Another major goal was to document speech errors in a non-Indo-European language, and so this was the first large study of Cantonese. We have about 2,500 errors. So what is a speech error? The standard definition of a speech error is an unintended, non-habitual deviation of a speech plan. Right? When we're speaking, we have a kind of a plan that we want to communicate, and almost on a pre-conscious basis, about once or twice a minute, people just make mistakes in the selection of consonants or the selection of words that they just can't help but do. All right? These occur at many different levels. They occur at the sound level, for example, leading list for reading list. They occur at the word level, like this side is a red V's, where they misselected the wrong color term. And they even happen in syntactic context. So this sounds quite odd when you say it. I'm not staying all up night, and so I'm not staying up all night, right, where the words have switched places. Sounds quite odd. So we use a standard classification system, identifying the linguistic level, the type of error, and also the direction, if you're looking ahead in anticipation, or the perseverating prior information and bringing that into the current word. We have over 100 variables to cross-classify these words. So the core methods that we use, and this diverges from prior research, is we collected speech errors offline from audio recordings. All right. In the past, much research has taken place in like classrooms, right, where you're listening to a professor and the professor makes a slip of tongue and someone's writing that down, or you go to a cocktail party and there's kind of a on-the-spot classification of an error. And instead of that, what we decided to use was audio recordings and listen very carefully to them and collect them that way because they can be verified, it can be replayed, and it also gives us a time metric for analyzing them. Another key feature is we use multiple data collectors instead of a single data collector, right? I trained 18 different undergraduate and graduate students where they received phonetic training, training based on psycholinguistics, and then I had a set of listening tests where I had pre-screened the recordings for the speech errors, and then I asked them to find them and I gave them feedback. And in that way the data collectors got quite good. A third important difference, and this is talked about in our language and speech paper, is we have a verification stage, right? So the data collectors listen to these recordings and they assemble a data submission and a spreadsheet, and then a different person listens to them and re-listens to the recording and verify them. And in this way, we cut out about 25% of the actual speech errors because they didn't meet the definition a speech error as a non-habitual deviation. So sometimes, for example, people have a dialect difference, or it's not clear that they didn't intend what they said. It's kind of they changed their mind mid-sentence. And so in many cases, we kind of throw speech errors out because we're not sure that it meets this standard definition. Okay, so that's the methods. And you can contrast that with prior analyses where the primary collection method is online, that is a direct observation. Look at a cocktail party. There is only one or two expert collectors and there's no verification process. So what we did actually in the beginning, we had the traditional method and we collected about 1,100 speech errors that way, and then we collected about 9,000 speech errors using offline audio recordings, and we're able to examine the differences of those two data sets, the online errors and the offline errors, and we found that there are many perceptual biases, things that have to do with the perceptual systems of people who collect them, that are reflected in the online errors and not in the offline errors. So for example, one important bias is that misperceptions of place, like labials versus coronals or something like that, are easier to detect than mispronunciations of voicing. So a T and a K versus a P and a P, right? So as you can see here, on the online errors, it reflects that bias with a larger number of errors having to do with place, but in the offline errors, there is no such bias. Right? It turns out there's just a host of different ways in which the offline errors and the online errors are different. So online errors have more corrected errors, which the talker corrects him or herself, right? And those are easier to spot because the correction is kind of like a red flag. A speech error took place. They're more subject to the so-called repeated phoneme effect. There's a strong lexical bias. A really important one is exchange errors. So think if you want to say left hemisphere, like the left hemisphere of your brain, people might say heft hemisphere, where there's the L and the H switch places. That's a relatively common one in offline errors, but they're actually quite rare. So in some online data collections, those are maybe a third or even 50% of the errors. But when you actually look at how common they are, they occur less than half of 1% of actual all errors. So this is a huge difference in the distributions, right? Another way we validated this was in sample coverage. All prior studies acknowledge that there are many errors that the data collector missed because they're making observations and time passes by and they just they don't make all of the observations that are before them. But they have no way of assessing the missed errors. They don't know what they've missed, okay? So what we used is a statistical technique that's used in field ecology called capture, where because we have many people collecting errors, we can look at the two different collections and look at overlap, and we can use that overlap to make a statistical estimate about the total population of speech errors, right? So using that technique called capture-recapture, we were able to estimate that an error occurs about, in a Cantonese data set, about twice a minute. So native speakers of Cantonese, in the recordings that we listen to, they make a speech error about twice a minute. And in our data set, we collected about 75% of those errors when you look at time that elapsed in our recordings. But when you look at a comparable study that didn't use the same methods, they have a sample coverage of about 25%. So they collected essentially 1 out of 10 errors in the larger data set, right? In other words, they missed a whole lot of the observations that are relevant. So we think that it's not representative of the patterns of speech errors. Okay, and this really, really matters, right? So all of the phonological patterns that we talked about at the beginning are different when we look at the data sets in these prior models and the data sets that we collected. So one of the perfect ones was the sound exchanges like Heft-Lemisphere. Stephanie Schaff-Hofnagel made the MIT Arizona speech error database, and her model predicts that there should be a large number of sound exchanges because of the nature of that model, and she says that this should be the most common type of speech error. That's a huge problem because they're the least common type of speech error when you look at the actual distributions, right? So this really, really matters for the correct analysis of speech errors. There's other aspects of this that are relevant. I will say that the database is all available online, both the Cantonese data set and the English data set, and you can go to the Open Science Forum website here and investigate, and we actually document our methods in some detail. Are you doing on time? Okay. Okay, so another issue that we're interested in is linguistic diversity. What insights can be gained by studying understudied languages? Our overarching goal is to explicate the cognitive mechanisms of human language, not just the languages of majority languages. But it's a major problem that psycholinguistic investigation has really been dominated by majority languages that are present in Western universities. So one study, Anand et al., found that 10% of the 10 most commonly spoken languages in the world constitute about 85% of all research that has taken place in the world. And this is also true of speech error studies. So I recently made a data set of all the speech errors available in psycholinguistic literature. And roughly 2/3 of them come from Indo-European languages. And just looking again at those top 10 languages that are given here, they are very similar to An's findings. They're 85% of all studies. You can also look at the actual data size or the corpus size, because in many languages like English and German, there are large corpora, and it's important criteria of the study that there be sufficient baselines to make statistical generalizations. Because if you have a small data set of only 100 observations or 200 observations, that limits the power you have to make broad generalizations about speech. And when you look at by summing up the sizes of these corpora, you can make even stronger statements about the lack of representation. So about 77% of all data comes from Indo-European languages, and 94% of all the data comes from the top 10 majority languages. There's a real problem in the representativeness of the data that we have here. So that was the motivation behind Spoofed Cantonese. There were no prior study of Cantonese speech errors, and there's really only one large study of a Chinese language, the work of Taiwanese linguist at Zhongce University. Cantonese and Chinese languages in general are interesting because they have tone, and they have very different syllable structures, and so we can look at those syllable structures to come back to these observations about how syllable structure shapes, how it shapes speech. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip the different research activities, but basically we spent a lot of time learning about Cantonese. We built some electronic resources, and then we collected data using similar methods that I talked about for English. This is an interface of the data set here where we represent this kind of illustrates the kind of information they have here. So we have a rich information about the speech error itself, and we analyze in the intended versus the error word. This is what's actually spoken, and this is what was intended by the speaker. And this is a sound error or phonological substitution, because the onset here is different from the error onset, which we analyze in the sound fields. And this illustrates the kind of, if you like phonology, you will like this, right? Because there's all kinds of information about the phonological structure of the error, because the phonological structure is patterned in these speech errors, okay? There's other information here we can look at later. So one of the key questions in psycholinguistic research is how syllables shape speech errors. And traditionally, this has been approached with the so-called syllable paradox, right? Syllable structure matters for the selection of segments when speaking because of the syllable position effect, right? Sounds slip into the same syllabic positions that they occur in the source words. So leading list, the L is an onset in the error, and it's in the onset position in the source word, right, in list. However, syllables themselves are not selected when we're making a phonological speech plan in phonological encoding. That's because of the single phoneme effect. Almost all speech errors are one segment or two segments. And this has been shown in some detail in English, right? So the vast majority of sound errors in Joe Stenberger's corpus involve single segments or just onsets or codas. So the standard analysis of the syllable paradox is that phonological encoding, the activation dynamics, that energy spreads through the network, and then one of those nodes is the most salient one, and we picked that one. Phonological encoding, it selects segments, but that segment is inserted into a syllable frame that respects the syllable structure, okay? So when we're selecting onset, that onset goes in onset position. When we're selecting a coda, that's coda consonant goes into the coda position. So the standard analysis is that we're selecting segments and inserting them into syllable frames, okay? The problem is that Chinese languages like Mandarin seem to be quite different. Syllables are central units of processing in Mandarin, and there's been a host of psycholinguistic studies that's shown that Mandarin is quite different. So the so-called form preparation studies, where people are instructed to kind of memorize pairs of words, and it's been shown that people kind of prepare in advance a syllable level unit that guides that memorization process. There have been speech error studies as well that have shown that there's a higher than expected rate of entire syllable slipping Speech errors involve entire syllables, and that's unlike what we find in English. For example, Chen 2000 found that roughly 8.4% of all sound errors were whole syllables if you take away the tone, right? So it shows that the syllable has a different role in a language that's different in Mandarin. So the leading hypothesis behind this is the so-called proximate unit hypothesis. When we're speaking, we have these ideas that we want to communicate, and then that is shaped by, we select a word to communicate those ideas, and then the word is then filled in with the consonants and vowels. The difference between Mandarin and English, this theory goes, is that Mandarin has a syllable level of encoding. We're taking the word and we're finding the consonants and vowels, but we find the consonants and vowels together as a chunk. English lacks this unit level of processing syllables, right? So the basic idea is the reason why English, Mandarin, okay, so I don't have that. Mandarin can have syllable errors because it selects syllables before selecting the segments, include them, and this can be misselected just like a word can be misselected, okay? English lacks that level, and so syllables are not misselected. However, there are problems with Chen's study. There are certain perceptual biases, as we actually saw, it had some poor sample coverage, and some of the possible syllable errors seem to be overrepresented relative to segmental errors. So there's just a host of problems, including the way the chance occurrence of syllable errors is calculated. So what we wanted to do is to take the core idea of Chen that syllables could be misselected and look at this in another language that is similar. So that was the goal for looking at this problem in Cantonese. Cantonese also has a reduced syllable structure, and there's even some work on the same kind of picture naming and priming studies that showed that native speakers of Cantonese kind of plan the syllable in advance in the same way that Mandarin speakers kind of plan this initial syllable. So our prediction was that Cantonese should also have a higher incidence of syllable errors, and that should be greater than just the chance occurrence of a consonant error and vowel error occurring simultaneously. So let's just cut to the chase because we have a little bit, we're short on time. This chart, which we talked about in our lab farm paper and a later paper in Language and Speech, shows the distribution and the frequencies of different types of phonological substitutions in Cantonese. And as you can see, syllable errors are non-negligible. They occur about 6% of the time. So this is comparable to Mandarin, which had about an 8% chance, but it's quite different from English, where syllable errors are vanishingly rare. But it doesn't establish yet the idea that syllable errors are greater than the joint probability of errors, and so we have to calculate that. So just looking at the phonological substitution errors, we estimated that this is about 31 hours of speech, and so you can calculate the expected frequency of an error given these possibilities as the joint probability. So anyone who knows probability knows that the probability of a CV error is just the product of the probability of an onset error together with a nucleus error. So basically you can think of it this way, like a speech error involving a consonant is a rare event, and a speech error involving a vowel is a rare event. But when you're looking at the joint probability, it's the product of those two. And so it should be vanishingly rare. So in this time frame, this 32-hour time frame, we expect there to be one, at best two speech errors involving a CV structure, and we expect there to be no errors involving a CVC. Because if the syllable itself is not selected, then the occurrence of a syllable error has to be the chance occurrence of these two rare events, or these three rare events. And so that's just not a tested data. We have over 50 examples of CV errors and 14 examples of CVC errors. And so that kind of illustrates the basic finding for Cantonese. So we were looking for evidence that syllables are stored and selected in Cantonese, but we were somewhat worried about this prior study because there are certain methodological problems. And so what we found here is that Cantonese is indeed like Mandarin, and it does exhibit the above chance occurrence of whole syllable error. So I want to make sure we have enough time to ask questions. And maybe now's a good time to ask questions if anyone wants to. Is it okay yeah? This is kind of an informal thing, so yeah. Does anyone have any questions about what we've talked about thus far? Do you see that there's some phonology here? There's some things that the phonologists, okay, that's the main thing. Okay, well, let's just keep going then. So another key question is tone. As you know, it's like 42% of the world's languages are tone languages, but we know very little about tone and the importance of tone in language processing. So a key question is, how is tone encoded when we get out into these languages other than German, other than English? There's actually two coherent theories of tone, and prior to this study, the leading hypothesis is that tone is in a sense like metrical stress. So in this graphic, the idea is that when we're planning to produce a word, there's a mapping that produces a kind of a tonal frame, and then there's a separate mapping selecting segments, and then this tone, the first tone gets mapped to the syllable, and the second tone gets mapped to the syllable. And this is very similar to the way people approach prosody in language production. The idea is that in language like English and Dutch, there's a separate mapping here for a metrical frame, and that metrical frame gives you a kind of a skeleton structure for ordering the syllables that are established in the segmental mapping. Alternative hypothesis is that tone is like segments. And in this proposal, advocated by Wan and Jaeger and others, essentially, just like consonants are selected, when we're producing a lexeme, there's a mapping where tone is associated with a particular lexeme, and these are activated in the same way that consonants and vowels are activated. And if this reaches a threshold level of activation, this is selected and correctly associated with that noun. Okay. So the key differences between this is that if tone is like metrical stress, we expect there to be almost no tone errors. If tone is like segments, we expect tone slips, like a slip of tongue in terms of the misselection of a tone, to be relatively common and have variable frequencies to consonants and vowels. And it's effectively what we found. So if you look again at the distribution of different kinds of errors, we have sound substitutions of consonants and vowels, we have sound additions and sound deletions. Tone substitutions in our corpus are the second most common type of error. We have over 400 tone slips in our data set. So it's just, when we look back at these theories, it's just not the case that tone is not misselected, and it's very different from stress. By the way, the reason why people feel that stress errors are infrequent is that in studies of languages like English and Dutch, people just do not misselect the tone or the stress. People have very robust control of the stress patterns of the words they produce, and they misselect the consonants and vowels. When there are things that appear to be stress errors, people often think that it's actually not a sound error, but a word error, and they misselect a morphologically related word that has a different stress pattern. So instead of ambiguous, you do ambiguity, right? Where the stress for the noun is different from the stress from the adjective. And so people have said, including leaders like Stephanie Schader-Hocknagel, that really the metrical structure is robust and not really selected for. And that's very different from Wan and Jaeger's analysis. Tone is something that's actively selected. And so what our results show is that tone does seem to be like consonants and vowels. It does seem to be actively selected. A follow-up to this is that the majority of tone errors are contextual. That is, they're due to the tone in the neighboring words. So in this example, do has a mid-level tone, and it should have a rising tone, a 2-3 tone, and that's because it's looking ahead to the tone in the syllable two syllables downstream, right? And it's this kind of anticipatory activation that is the hallmark of consonant and vowel misselections. So the fact that most of them are contextual is completely consistent with them having high frequency. Another really important fact about tone errors and consonants and vowels as well is that they exhibit what we call interactive spreading effects. That is, when we're grabbing the consonant and vowels of the words that we produce, that's not independent of the network of other structures. Okay? So concretely, we have higher rates of errors when there is shared phonological structure. Right? And there's actually several different ways to observe this. So probably the most common one is, or most salient one, is the phonological similarity effect. Okay? The phonological similarity effect is that intended sounds and intruder sounds tend to be phonologically similar. So anyone who studies phonology knows that phonologically similar means they have similar features. They have similar phonological makeup. And so in this example here, P and B share certain features. They are both labial, they're both minus sonorant, they're both minus nasal. And in the spreading activation, the spread energy through the node network, when energy spreads through here and passes to this feature, then it goes back up to the B, and then down to another F, and then back up to the P. And so what that has the effect of making P and B very similar in their activation levels. And say you want to say a word like batch, P is also getting a high amount of activation, and with a little bit of noise, that can push P up and actually inadvertently lead to its selection. That's why forms that share structure can be misselected, right? So the prediction is that if tone is really like consonants and vowels, we expect this similar kind of shared structure to lead to a higher incidence of errors. That would be a very subtle form of evidence that tone is selected in ways that are similar to consonants, and that's exactly what we found. So we found a tonal similarity effect, or phonological similarity effect for tone. So when we make a tonal confusion matrix, where we say these are the tones that were intended, these are the tones produced in the errors, it's the phonologically similar tones that tend to be misselected. There's also a kind of a repeated tone effect where phonological substitutions that have the same tone in the syllable, it's that shared tone that leads to more misselections with the consonants. There's even lexical substitutions that are kind of facilitated by a shared tone, right? So this is not expected if tone is a separate mapping that is robust, like prosody, but it is expected if tone is a part of this larger activation network, right? And so this is the value of looking at a language like Cantonese and really drilling down into the data. As you can see that tone is really different than prosody, right? It's a different kind of structure, and it really informs the psycholinguistic modeling of planning tone in the process of speaking. So our revised model is something like this. Languages like Mandarin and Cantonese have syllable units that are planned and potentially misselected. That's what accounts for syllable errors. Tones and segments are actively selected and selected separately, right? So we have a kind of an activation dynamics for picking out the consonants and vowels for words, and that's separate from tone, but they're a part of the larger network, so shared structure for tone could increase activation of segments. I'll skip this part on complex errors. It tells us a little bit more about how tone is aligned with the ultimate syllables. Excuse me. So the larger conclusions are, we have some important theoretical results. Syllables seem to be, have a central role in production planning in languages like Mandarin and Cantonese, which is different in kind from English and German. Tone is actively selected in phonological encoding, very similar to the way phonological segments are encoded. And that, again, is very different from languages like English and German. Tone is encoded in a way that's interactive. It exhibits spreading activation through a network, and shared structure can kind of shape the speech errors in ways that are important. I didn't really talk about the tonal syllable frame, but basically it's the idea that ultimately we have to get the tone on a larger syllable, and there's some evidence for that as being kind of a, we think that there's, once we have a selected tone, that gets associated with a larger tonal frame because of some other interactions at this level. So the larger take-homes are methods really matter in looking at speech errors. If you have a speech error database that is shaped by human perception and skewed in ways, it is less informative, and it limits your ability to investigate the mental processes involving sound production. Linguistic diversity also matters, right? These conclusions that we've established here really are only arrived at by the detailed investigation of an understudied language, and I believe that there's a whole host of work that can be done in investigating understudied languages that can inform psycholinguistics. I have some other ideas here about cross-linguistic coverage, and we exploited the fact that we have audio recording and enable us to look at the phonetic structure. But I think in the interest of time, since we only have 30 minutes, maybe it'd be good to just kind of open it up for questions. And yeah. By the way, these are my collaborators. Thank you. Oh, of course, yes.
Thank you so much, John, for this very interesting presentation. And I think that our students and our colleagues will probably pick up interest in dealing with speech errors. So we have 30 minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, and for
take a quick break. I can do
okay, go ahead.
Be back in.
For reasons of logistics, I'll be giving the mic to the speakers. Okay, so that the audio goes on the video. Okay, so we'll take a first round of questions. I have one question from Professor Abdelaziz Boudlel and another question from Professor Nabila Louris, and then we can take a second round of questions. So you'll have to speak into the mic. It makes a difference for the video. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Karim, John. It's so nice to see you after so long. We come here. I'd like also to thank Karim for getting us all together to talk about speech errors, but also phonology as well. Now, a very good presentation indeed. Thank you very much. So I have a question relating to the data you have worked on and the conclusions you've arrived at. Were you able to make any patterns based on the sounds that that show these exchanges? Like, in other words, from what we saw, I mean, the sounds that show exchanges are sounds that have shared structures. Just based on these errors, were you able come up with a list of pairings, like these are the sounds that are possible, that can possibly show this exchange and lead to errors relating to sounds. I'm not talking about structure like p and f, but exchanges that relate to sounds that are distant, that do not have common, that do not share features. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing, and I'm just anticipating errors in languages like Moroccan Amazigh. This is a call for researchers who work on Amazigh to consider speech errors. Now, relating to tone, I'm just thinking of languages that assign stress, for example, to position rather than a syllable. Like in case there are errors that involve vowels, from different positions, but the quality of the vowels are different. And I'm not sure, because these are questions I'm asking. I don't know, because you've considered other languages. Are there situations where you have, you have cases where speech errors, occur, but then vowel stress does not change? This is by opposition to the tone cases that you considered in Cantonese. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Boubla. It's again also good to see you after all these years. I remember the days at UMass Amherst, where we would have parties together. Your question is an insightful one, and it's one that has been investigated in some detail. For the specific segments, we do encode them in. We do analyze them using confusion matrices. So you can look at individual segments. And essentially, a standard analysis is to take all of the consonants of a language and put them on rows, and those are the sounds that were intended to be spoken, and then have columns for those same sounds, and then look at the frequencies of those. And so you can see very often that intended sounds and error sounds are usually in the same place class. So there's lots of interaction among labials. There's lots of interaction among other kind of natural classes. But one consistent exception, this was argued for by both Stephanie Shattuck-Hufnagel and Joe Stemberger, is so-called palatal bias, where, let me get this correct. It seems to be that palatals are misselected for other palatals, ch and j, and those are kind of opposite what you would expect in the similarity effect and other kinds of frequency effects. And so that was another thing for phonology, is that people said this is evidence for underspecification, because these sounds have a lack structure in the kind of phonological analysis, and so can be selected for because they're kind of default sounds, right? But we've actually looked at the actual statistical analysis of these, and the prior analyses failed to look at the kind of the base rate of occurrence of these sounds. And so when you look at, so like one of the perfect examples is s to sh, because sh is a palatal, and the argument was that that was a evidence for the palatal bias. Because there, when you look at these confusion matrices, you have a large number of those substitutions. But the problem is that there's many more opportunities to produce an S because an S is a far more frequent sound than a sh. So when you're looking at s to sh versus sh to s, there's just many more chances to do this to sh, and so the higher rate of that case is a base effect. It's a baseline frequency effect. And so it's, when we look at these larger conformal matrices, we really need to look at the baseline frequencies to make these assessments, and people hadn't done that in the past. Getting to your stress question, yes, it does seem to be the case that stress syllables are, people said that the stress is more salient, but also the stress syllable is more frequently a source for the sounds for intruders in a sound substitution. I don't know that anyone has ever said the same thing about exchanges, which was your original question, but there is something about salience of syllables in terms of their ability to be manipulated and prone to error, and so that does require some analysis, and I don't know if anyone's given a theoretical account of that, but perhaps we can follow up over email and talk about the possibilities. No, but I think that your questions are insightful because they're similar to some of the directs that have been taken in psycholinguistic research, including by phonologists like Joe Stenberger is a psycholinguist and a phonologist, right?
We have another question, Professor Nabila Louriz.
Thank you. It's recording like this. I have two questions, one about syllable and one about tone. For the syllable, you said that CV syllables are more frequently selected in perception. Did I understand it right? 51 cases and 14 cases?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, okay. So if this is the case, is it because the CV type syllable is more common in the language?
That's a really good question.
Or, can I say, or is it because it is unmarked? In other words, the CVC has coda and the coda is marked. I finished first and I stop now?
That's really
okay.
Good. Maybe I'll just address that and
I have
then
another
the second one. So yeah, Matt Goldrick has a dissertation on the role of markedness, and there is an effect of people look at English and there is an effect of markedness and speech errors, but it's not absolute. So there is a statistical tendency for the substitutions to produce unmarked structures, and Matt Goldrick in his dissertation at Northwestern University looked at different consonant substitutions, and he sorted out the frequency bias versus the markedness bias, and he found some experimental evidence for a markedness bias. So we do expect that outcome of speech errors to be have a kind of a preference for being unmarked, and he has some ideas about how it's formalized using harmonic grammar, using the constraint-based approaches. And I don't know, I mean, it seems like a pretty straightforward connection to syllable structure to do that because of the existence of constraints like coda and onset that would shape syllables this way. So I think you could continue his line of research using segmental markedness constraints to syllable structure markedness constraints. But I think you would also have to do what he did, which was to look at the frequencies of those syllable types as well, and determine, like what I was talking about, Dr. Boulal's question, is it the chances of producing a CV syllable greater than the chances of producing a CVC syllable? I think it's actually more common to have a CVC syllable, right? So that's even more in line with, I have to look up the resources. So we do have frequency norms for syllables in Cantonese, so that's a tractable problem. Yeah. Is there a second question?
My second question is about tone, so I hope I can word it clearly because I'm new to tone. I would be interested to know whether the type of tone, like T2 and T4, are more frequent than T1 and T3, and in language acquisition, at least in child language acquisition, we know that T2 is perceived more correctly in initial position. T4 is perceived more correctly in the final position. Does this information find evidence in speech errors? In other words, would T2 tones be less frequent, errors would be less frequent in initial position, and T4 tones would be less frequent in final position? So my question is combination of type of tones and the position.
Which ones are you referring to?
The raising and the falling tones. Mm-hmm. Versus low.
5-3, but that's the high falling tone, but that's it's kind of lost. There are some native speakers that still have the 5-3, but it's been neutralized by the 5-9.
And is it related to position, to the edges?
Yeah, I don't know. Look at that with more entries. So yes, the perception of these tones relative to position is important, and it's certainly something that we should attend to. That is I would say that's more of a methodological question, because it has to do with the perceptual systems of the person collecting the errors. And so if that is a perceptual bias, then we want to make sure that it's not overrepresented. Just like the place bias in English, where we showed that if you're under more trying conditions, you're more susceptible to the place bias. So it's a similar thing for this, and we would have to examine that. But we do have long form entries of the errors, right? So we could, we could consider, like here's the error. We could consider, so this is an initial position. We could look at the the long form entry of the error and determine its position in the larger utterance, and then use that information to determine if there was a perceptual bias. That's kind of I guess that's more of a check on the validity of the data rather than the mechanisms of production, right? Because a person speaking is not affected by those biases. This is the person collecting the errors, right? I will say that there is another issue that's kind of connected to this, which is that is a well-known tonal merger taking place in Mandarin. I don't control the data here because I worked on this like 5 years ago, but essentially, like the low rising is merging with the high rising. And so there's a set of mergers that are a change in progress in the tonal system of Cantonese right now. That is exactly what you're talking about. People could have perceived that merger as a speech error and as a kind of a natural occurring speech error. It could be something that is, in other words, it's a habitual phenomenon because there is this change in progress, not a non-habitual speech error, right? And so we spend quite a lot of time distinguishing the mergers from speech errors, and we're really confident that the tonal errors that we've documented are not tonal mergers. So we've trained them on that. We had another analyst come through and re-examine the data to make sure that they did not represent these tonal mergers that are a change in progress. Right? So you're definitely right in asking about the if the tonal patterns are indeed shaped by these kind of larger perceptual biases. But I mean, I just don't think it's possible to there's just so many of those errors that it just couldn't be the case that all those errors are misperceived. Yeah.
We can afford one or more questions.
Just a very quick on mind. Just the errors that were considered are always in equal positions. I was just wondering whether there are, frequent cases that take place elsewhere.
You mean word initial positions
Yeah.
or utterance initial?
Right, yeah.
That's a really good question because
Oh, sorry.
that again is another key question that has been really important in psycholinguistic literature, and there is a well-known statistical trend in speech errors called the word onset bias. So in most languages, there is a statistical tendency for speech errors to occur at the beginnings of words. So in English, most people, in many of the English speech error collections, maybe 60 to 80% of the errors occurred word initially. Right? There are speech errors that occur word internally and word finally, and those are included in the data set here, but there's a very strong statistical trend for errors to occur word initially and also syllable initially. So you have to distinguish the syllable onset effect from the word onset effect. And people have used this to test and investigate models of speaking. So a really interesting paper, if you're interested in this topic, is Gary Dell and colleagues, 1993, on kind of a frequency effect and the word onset effect, where he says that the reason why errors occur frequently in the beginnings of words is because you don't have anything before it to help you predict the future. So once you have a little bit of a nibble on the beginning of a word, then that helps you figure out how a word could be completed. But at the beginning of the word, you don't have any prior structure to predict what comes next, right? And he has a special neural network model that kind of explains that effect. However, it's more complicated because there's a psycholinguist in New Zealand whose name is Wilshire. Wilshire, 1998. She did an experiment probing the word onset effect. And there's a really interesting fact about this, which is that you only get the word onset effect in contextual errors. So you only get the word onset effect if it's influenced by the following word. There's no word onset effect if it's non-contextual. And Dale doesn't have an explanation for that. So that's something that again, there's still some problems to be solved here, and that's an example of one. But you're definitely right in observing that many of these here are word initial, because that's a general trend of many speech error databases.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you again. Okay, yes, it's fine. Okay, because I can't. Okay, fine. So I would like to ask you a question with respect to identity. Okay, because you have brought up this notion of identity and its importance. In terms of driving error and mistakes in general. So I just would like to know about the notion of distance. Okay, the idea has been brought up before by Mr. Woodland. Okay, do errors take place within the principled limits?
Yeah.
Okay, within syllables, for example, 2 syllables, feet. Okay, what are the domains within which? Okay,
6.
yeah.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
So, it's a really good question.
It's okay. Yeah, 6 you said.
I can say a lot more about this. But
Oh yeah. Okay, fine.
so the standard analysis is, and it's kind of a problematic observation is that there's a 6-syllable window. So when you're planning a utterance, people tend to plan phonologically about 6 syllables ahead and are influenced by 6 syllables before. And that's based on the trends in a speech error database in Dutch developed by Nuteboom. This is really problematic, though, because basically what he did is he looked at the occurrence of errors, and he just saw a real drop-off in the frequencies of errors in syllables beyond that 6-syllable window. However, that doesn't account, again, for base effects. So different sounds have different frequencies. There are probably a kind of statistical structure that allows for errors to occur within that same basic window. So just think about tone, right? Mandarin is a language with 4 tones. So every syllable, you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting a different tone, right? And so, you know, if you think about that, and then you can add the frequencies of those individual tones. I mean, it's a more frequent tone that has a 1/4 chance occurrence. Does that kind of hem in or push out the window of possibilities? So basically, I think that we can't really have a hard constraint on those windows. I think what we have to do is think more concretely about the chance occurrence of those. Because when you think about it, the idea is that there's a tone that's the same tone a little bit downstream, but it could have occurred there by chance. Right? So there's no, we're assuming that someone is planning a syllable and they're thinking ahead to the same tone, and that's what leads to the occurrence of that error tone. But it could have just occurred there by chance, right? And so when we think about these windows, right, or these, the distance metric, we have to factor in chance, and no one has done that. Right. So this is I mean, I think we've seen in this discussion is all the topics that have come up in psycholinguistics in the last 50 years are still kind of worth pursuing and thinking about. You know. And we need languages like Tashlahate and Arabic to examine them.
I have just a basic question. Whether languages select syllable or segments, is the motivation typological? I just don't know.
Yeah, that's an unanswered question too. Basically, we answered this question by looking at the evidence. And so there's the form preparation studies where people, it seems like people are planning ahead in terms of syllables or planning ahead in terms of segments. And then we correlate that with the speech error studies. And some people have said that it has something to do with the structure of the language. So Mandarin, for example, has a small number of syllables, and English and Dutch have a much higher number of syllables. So Mandarin has maybe 500 syllables. You can basically, because of the limited combinations and onsets and limited combinations and coda positions, but Dutch and English have much more because they have more complex onsets and there's more combinatorial possibilities. And so they say that it's that inventory restriction that leads to the existence of this syllable planning unit. But I don't think that's really been tested in the world's languages. And so this kind of a typological issue, whether the empirical evidence that combines form preparation studies with speech error studies pans out with that kind of structural constraint. So that's an unanswered question, I think. Yeah.
We have one more question. Of course. See, Sharfi.
Your corpus, of course, did not include second language learners, but I was wondering if your model could also work for L2 adders.
Yeah, it could. So if this is something that interests you, I recently, with Karstutza, formerly at UCLA, we built a kind of a annotated bibliography where you can search the bibliography, and there are some people who have looked at speech errors in second language acquisition. Nanda Poulous is a Dutch scholar, looked at this in English learners of Dutch. And she found that there are some similarities. So I think you have to distinguish other kinds of errors in second language acquisition from the speech errors. And she has found that there are lots of similarities between the structure of speech errors in like first language and the structure of a second language learning. But I think that her thesis is probably the best place to look for that. It's Poulous, 1990 something. And it's really has strong methods, and she's really informed by theories of second language acquisition, which I really don't control very well. But if that's what you're interested in, I would suggest that. If you, I have a copy on my computer. You can send me an email. I'll send you his email attachment if you like. Yeah.
One more question. Sinordin. Amrus Nordin.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, thank you, Professor Alderete. I would like to point to a methodological problem, unless I don't understand the issue very well. If we compare, for example, the errors in second language acquisition, their frequency is, well, they occur with high enough frequency, and researcher can have access to these errors either by, recording spontaneous speech, or by probably using instruments for data collection, or like obligatory occasions where the error is likely to occur. But when it comes to speech errors, which are characteristic of native speakers, it's native speaker who makes these speech errors, how is it likely, for example, to come across an error? And this itself, to my mind, is a methodological problem. So yeah, so how do specialists in the field undergo this problem of finding these errors? Thank you.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. I don't know. I really don't control the methods, but I'm pretty sure that the Poulous thesis addresses that in some detail. And I would say that that's also relevant for other domains too, because aphasia, for example, aphasic patients have a higher incidence of errors, and so there are cases where, if you look at 100 different productions of a word, upwards of 70% of the errors are misproductions, and some of them not be classified as speech errors in the same sense. So there's lots of ways where you need to methodologically distinguish pre-conscious misselection from other kinds of errors in production, and so that's a really common one, and I just don't control the second language acquisition literature well enough, but I would say that the first place to look is the Poulous thesis. So that's all I can say right now, so unfortunately. Yeah.
If you allow me, I have a question. I'll make it short. So yeah, the interesting thing is that I don't know of any studies of American languages that deal with speech errors, and you mentioned in your data statistics, maybe if you look at the speech errors for English, it's 20,000, if my memory is right. The number of speech errors for English. It's 21,000, I think, and as opposed to 900 something for Arabic. So the comment is 27 and then 911. So the idea is when we look at Arabic, what is it really that we mean by Arabic? Is it standard or just the vernaculars? Okay, so Egyptian. Now, the question is this, when it comes to Arabic, and this also joins the discussion that we raised earlier. Now, the status of standard Arabic in comparison to Moroccan Arabic, there is this diglossic situation, so you could still consider two languages being related. But then what happens if we have native speakers of Amazigh making those speech errors? Will they be considered second language errors or something like that? So the situation is a little bit tricky in Morocco, and probably methodologically you need to be careful. I'm addressing this to the students too, so that if, in case they are interested in this area, which is really, very, very promising. Now, the second question is when it comes to Tashhid, for example, with its very intricate syllable structure. I mean, like, I don't see, for the time being, what benefits we would draw from the analysis of speech errors when it comes to confirming types of syllable structures and things like that, especially with the consonant syllabicity hypothesis. So it's a common question.
Yeah, all I can say is that psycholinguistics has developed many models based on monolingual speakers, and that this doesn't reflect the reality of most of the world. Most of the world is multilingual speakers, and so we have to engage with a bilingual mind. And there are some models, again, guided by second language acquisition. So there are, in fact, that's one of the hottest areas of psycholinguistics right now is bilingualism. But I don't think we'll get into any real answers today. I think in the Poulis article, though, or thesis, he does document some overlap between the structural properties of speech errors for the past 50 years and of second language researchers. So there is some at least initial evidence that there is a common ground empirically, and that's something to think about. And I guess talk about Tashhid another day. Yeah.
So I'll resume my role as a moderator just to close the session. On behalf of myself and the audience and the university officials, I would like to thank John Alderete for having given us this wonderful opportunity to listen to his research on speech errors, and I hope that this has triggered some interest in our students, because this is an area which personally I don't know much when it comes to our languages, so it would probably be a promising field of research. I would like to thank the audience for having been such a nice audience and people who have asked all the questions. John, you have been most patient. I thank you for that. And I would like to reiterate my thanks to the Dean of the Faculty, to the administrative support that we've had. I think this has been a wonderful opportunity and a wonderful morning, and I would like to thank you all for this.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.